I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next panel, which is Peace and Conflict 1. On this panel, we have Luis Fuentes from Forsyth Technical Community College, Randi Hendricks from Washington University in St. Louis, Marcos Quinones from Guttman Community College, Zoya Ahmer from University of Pennsylvania, and Kira Boden-Gologorsky and Gaia Caramazza, who are a team from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. So, yes, clap for our panelists, claps. And Luis, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody enjoyed lunch. Let me brace this up. Just to preface this, if you guys see me squinting, is because I broke my glasses right on my plane trip here to Washington, so it might be a little hard for me to kind of read my notes, but just bear with me. Sure thing. Okay. So today my project is about navigating uncertainty, the Venezuelan diaspora in Lima's informal economy. So first I want to kind of preface this by talking about informality in the region in South America. It is an issue that is endemic to the whole region. Peru is not unique in high rates of informality, and but the Venezuelan population in Peru suffers significantly higher rates of informality, and this is due to systemic issues that I'll be covering here. So around 70% of Lima's workers operate in the informal economy. That number for Venezuelans is around the 80 to 90% mark. This is disputed just because there hasn't been enough research. And of course, the numbers of Venezuelans actually working in Lima is very difficult for researchers to track, just simply because many are undocumented or, of course, working informally. So. By this point, you're probably wondering, what is informality? So I want you guys to picture your local cab driver or the local corner store, bodega. These people are the people who in Peru would be working informally. Typically individuals or small business owners who are not registered or who do not pay taxes, and who thereby do not receive any type of government aid or cannot participate in government programs, et cetera, et cetera. So, of course, no labor protections, too. Something I want to touch on of why this issue is important is also the access to healthcare. Because they are working informally, many Peruvians and Venezuelans alike cannot access basic healthcare. Peru has a two-tiered healthcare system. The private sector clinics are typically very expensive, so most people cannot afford them. And then the public sector healthcare is typically provided through an employer, and you have to register them through there. So that's why also Venezuelans cannot access healthcare as much. Venezuelan migrants often work in non-decent jobs. This is because, of course, no labor protections. So, earn less, work more hours, and I feel like I'm going in circles. But yes, no labor protections. So no OSHA, no unions, no collective bargaining. So I want to touch on something more personal. When you're talking about an issue, you really want to put a face to the issue. And these two men who I interviewed in the neighborhood of Jose Palma in Lima, Callao, were two of my biggest sources to kind of connect to this. Vladimir Hill was a Venezuelan migrant, or is a Venezuelan migrant, who recently arrived to Peru. when I interviewed him, he had been in the country for less than a month. He's a good example of a Venezuelan migrant who does not have necessarily legal documentation, which pushes him to work informally. However, Alexander here, the combi driver below, he actually is a documented migrant. Still, though, he still has to work informally, even though he has all his documentation updated and he is registered and is a legal migrant to Peru. And this is because of the challenges that Venezuelan migrants have in actually updating their documentation, their degrees, validating their studies. And due to the economic instability that informality kind of presents to the community as a whole, he is kind of forced to change professions quite a lot. He's worked as a cook, he's worked as a combi driver, he's worked as a teacher, as an engineer, as a car repairman. And in my article, he actually told me a very funny story of how he ended up actually getting deported from Peru back to Venezuela because his documentation was valid, but it was misfiled, essentially, is the long and short of it. So what are some of the main takeaways I got from this? Through speaking with researchers, I found systemic challenges that made Peru particularly vulnerable to the challenges of informality. So these challenges were, for example, a Peruvian law which originated from a desire to protect Peruvian labor and the Peruvian worker, wherein only 20% of workers can be foreign or foreign-born. So originally, this was meant to prevent companies, Western companies like ExxonMobil or mining companies from bringing in cheap labor from abroad. But what this has done in turn is actually just prevent Venezuelan workers from accessing the same kind of jobs and labor protections that most Peruvian citizens have. There is little to no incentives for businesses to hire migrants formally when they can pay them less by having them work informally. And of course, like that antiquated law, just immigration policy has just not managed to keep up with anything. So to kind of wrap this up, there was a general pessimism that I found that researchers had, but more solutions-based, I guess, was there was a proposal to adopt a policy of partial formalization, and I kind of go over that more in my article, where, of course, the municipality of Lima kind of collaborates with different NGOs like USAID and the UN to train Venezuelan workers and to help them acquire resources and training and documentation. So it seems like I am out of time, so thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Randi Hendricks, and I'm from Washington University in St. Louis. In this summer, I went to the West Bank and reported on Palestinian life under occupation, especially given what's going on in Gaza and Lebanon right now. So please bear with me. I have a couple minutes to explain one of the most complex and controversial issues in human history. So I'm just going to get started with a brief overview of the West Bank because it's really important to understanding how Palestinians live here and the division of the area. So the West Bank, after the first Arab-Israeli war, which created the state of Israel, was controlled by Jordan. And the people that inhabited this region, which is part of present-day Israel and the occupied territories today and borders Jordan to the east, laying west of the Jordan River, hence the name West Bank, was populated by Palestinians and Palestinian refugees from the war. And this was under Jordanian control until the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, when the Israeli occupation that goes on to this day started. And this is really important because during this time is when the first Israeli settlers started settling in the area, changing the demographics of this land, making it no longer exclusively populated by Palestinians. And so there was many events, as listed here, that changed the nature of the occupation that I'll go through really quick. And so after the first Palestinian Intifada against the Israeli occupation, there was a peace accords that eventually fell through, but it is the reason that the area looks like Swiss cheese. And so it is divided into 3 separate zones. And I went to the city of Nablus, which is located in Area A, which is under control of the Palestinian Authority, which was supposed to be a 5-year interim government in 1993, but it is obviously not 1999. So it was, it is lasted to this day, and Area A controls the major population centers of the Palestinians, and it's the smallest part of the West Bank, so 18%. And then the rest is controlled mainly all by Israel, especially Area C, which is where the settlers live. And Nablus here is located surrounded by 24 Israeli settlements, which makes it a really big city in this conflict in the West Bank. And so, and then obviously at the end, after the October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel and the subsequent war, the West Bank has seen an unprecedented rise in violence that fades into the background on this issue, especially with what's going on into Lebanon right now. So I really wanted to highlight what is happening in the West Bank because it's underreported. So I was in Amman doing a story on Palestinian identity in Jordan, and so I had to go from Amman to Nablus, and actually from some hills in Amman, if you ever go there, you realize you can see Nablus and you can see the West Bank, and maybe if you drove straight, it would be about an hour, but let's just say my journey took much longer than an hour. Basically, it took an entire day, so I went from Amman on the 6 a.m. bus to the King Hussein Bridge, and then that's the Jordanian crossing. Then I went to the Israeli crossing. Then I went to the Palestinian Authority crossing, so I went from 3 bridges, and that was right by the border. This is a little messed up, but right there. And the Palestinian Authority crossing was in Ariha, and so I went from Ariha to Nablus on a Palestinian bus. And if I drove straight, this would have taken about 45 minutes, but instead took almost 3 hours because in the West Bank, Palestinian and Israelis do not drive on the same roads. They have separate roads, and so I took the Palestinian routes for everything. So I really got to see how the restriction of Palestinian movement is in this area, which I'll get more on later. And so the reason I chose Nablus is because it's a really important city. In the conflict in the West Bank, it has one of the biggest Palestinian refugee camps in the world, the New Ascar refugee camp, which I went to. It has seen an unprecedented rise in violence, especially considering that there is a lot of militant groups rising in Nablus. And so I added some terms here just to clarify. Some of these groups are designated as violent militant groups, some are designated as terrorist groups, and those I spoke to refer to them as al-Muqawama, which means resistance. And I just wanted to get my terms straight. And then there's also, because of this, a lot of military raids every night. And again, the settlements around Nablus. And so my main story focused on a West Bank resident. His name is Mohammed. And basically, he is a 21-year-old nursing student. And I wanted to follow his story because he is just a regular 21-year-old in Nablus. And I thought it would be interesting to cover how his life is affected by the occupation. So basically, we drove around the city from his house. And from everywhere in the city, you look up and you see the settlements. So here's my picture of the Ilan Murray settlement. And then also there's checkpoint lines if you ever want to leave the city. I took a photo of the checkpoint line and I showed it to Mohammed, and he sent me about 20 photos where there was like much more cars, and he's like, no, these are better photos, so I included his photo. And then you can also see the settlements are connected to the settler Israeli roads that don't have checkpoints. And then here's just a quick map. So Mohammed took me driving from his house to all these checkpoints. And then I also circled this big settlement you can see from everywhere in the city. And because of the war in Gaza, 3 of these checkpoints are closed, making it harder for Palestinians to travel outside of their city. Okay, and then a lot of my story focused on Mohammed's 2 arrests, which were really interesting and obviously had a big impact on his life. He was arrested when he was a teenager twice for crossing the border wall between the West Bank and Jerusalem to pray at the Masjid al-Aqsa, which is the 3rd holiest site in Islam. And the second time, he made it over the fence, and he was arrested and beaten in jail by soldiers. So he described that traumatic moment for him, and I wrote about it in my story. And then in 2024, Mohammed described how his life has changed, and I took this picture outside of my window. I had stayed with Mohammed and his family, and I woke up to the sound of military trucks, and so I took my phone out and took a picture. But they come to the camps and conduct raids to for the maintaining security because of the resistance and violent militant groups. And he also described to me how in one of the raids, his friend from childhood passed away. And then here's some pictures of Nablus in 2024. You can just see how all over the city there's posters about these militant groups, and this didn't used to be the case before the war in Gaza, so you can see how it affects the city. And then here's some stats just to put numbers to what I'm talking about, but really the most important thing I wanted to highlight was people's personal stories, but these are just some statistics. And then I really wanted to go back as I finished my presentation to this sign I saw entering Nablus. And this sign really filled me with a lot of emotion. It says, "This road leads to Area A under the Palestinian Authority. The entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, and it is against Israeli law." So when I read this sign, I was filled with a lot of fear and sadness. And to me, it felt more of a message of, less of a message about danger and more of a message about who is considered dangerous. And it put me in a place to think, what if this sign was outside of my city? And beyond that red sign, I got to know the people living there. And it was just a really impactful sign. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Marcos Quinones, and I will be presenting my story, Campus Spring, the Student Intifada. So I'm not only just going to be talking about what my story is or what it's about, I want to walk you through the process of how I even came up with what my story would end up being. So originally, my project was just supposed to be about my coverage of the protests and pretty much how I was able to cover them. But then I had a moment that really stuck with me when I was trying to post a picture that I had taken. This one in particular, where an officer had slammed his baton into my chest right where my press badge was hanging, right around where this name tag is hanging. And the trouble that I had wasn't just about explaining my trauma in this situation, it was more so the issues that I had seen and the problems that I had seen other journalists face for documenting these particular protests, either being labeled as anti-Semitic, terrorist sympathizers, being blacklisted, being ostracized, losing their jobs for just explaining the reality of the situation. So as I sat up one night trying to come up with a caption for this picture, instead of coming up with a caption, I ended up writing a poem about this very difficult time that we're in, not only for journalists, but for students and activists and just people who want to stand for something greater than themselves. The name of the poem is Scattered Thoughts of a Journalist, and I said, and it goes, "Would your pieces be so objective if it were your child's body on our screens? Did the checks clear your conscience? Did sleep come easy? Did you stay up nauseous? Were you a beacon of truth or an enemy of progress? Was the job worth it? Did they pay enough for your silence? Are you proud of your answers? Is this something you've acknowledged?" And thank you. So having gone through these things and having gone through these very like mentally tormenting nights trying to figure out how to document this story, I realized that there was a story within telling the story, which is what my story is about, or this chapter of my story is about. I went around interviewing journalists, independent journalists, student journalists, and decorated documentarians about what their experience was out here after having not only been attacked by police myself, but having been just even the stairs and even being in these very high pressured and historically relevant moments where you might not, some people lose the moment and don't really understand how important it is to not only tell the story, but to hear the people who are telling the story and to know that these people have experiences too. And I feel like journalists are always so hyper focused on getting the story right or telling the story, but no one ever asked them their story. And that's what this project was about. And what I ended up learning about journalism and our role in these environments from the journalists that I spoke to, such as one in the back right now, who is a very close friend of mine. His Instagram is Nobi Films. His name is Chitty. Was that the role of a journalist in these environments, we are the last line of defense, not only for the people, but for the truth and for the integrity of this country. We are the only ones who have the truth. So the role of the journalist becomes not only we're not only a sword, we're not just a pen, we're not just a camera, we're a shield. And we're here to defend, you know, the truth. And when I say the truth, I mean, I have experienced many different moments in documenting this and even in studying it across the country and across the world where the truth is not really getting out to the people. And in fact, we're just being prescribed the same stories and the same tones and the same everything just from different doctors, different platforms, different entertainment networks that have no regard for what the truth may be or have no regard for the people that they are talking of. So I just wanted to show you guys some pictures that I had taken, and if there were any questions, I would save them for the end during the question part. But I had experienced something even beyond being assaulted by police or having a police officer literally try to steal my camera, which is a part of my documentary. I had just experienced what it took to even be in these situations, how press members had, independent press who didn't have a Fox News network thing or, you know, a New York Times press pass, I had to sneak onto campuses. I had to get myself into these environments that I otherwise wouldn't be allowed to. And I had to develop connections with the people on the ground in order to even be able to tell these stories or be allowed to, you know, interview them and take pictures and whatnot. And this is one of those moments during the Hins Hall takeover where I had to tell a security guard that I had left my camera equipment inside from an event that happened earlier. He said, okay. He looked at me. He was like, you're college age. Go ahead. But what I wanted to leave you all with is this is a room full of journalists, and I'm gonna finish a little bit early. But this is a room full of journalists, and as much as your stories matter, your story matters. And that's what this project, this is what I want to highlight in my project was that, you know, not only take care of yourselves, but also tell your story outside of the story because it matters. Whether you keep it to yourself, whether you write a memoir, whether you do a podcast or a documentary even on your experience, it matters. And when I was on YouTube trying to figure out how to tell a story like this or if there were other stories like this, I couldn't find much. There's not much on what the journalist experience is, not only in conflict zones, but just in highly, you know, tension-filled environments where you could be penalized even if you just write something objective, even if you're just writing the facts. 140 people arrested today was one of the captions that I wrote for one of my posts, and I was called anti-Semitic, and I was called all these things that really had nothing to do with my story or my integrity or myself. But that's important. That experience is important, and it's telling of our time. And if people don't hear that, they'll never know it. So whatever your story may be about, whether it's about the climate, whether it's about indigenous populations, whatever it's about, make sure in those field notes that you take a moment to write your story and your experiences. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Zoya. I'm a senior at the University of Pennsylvania, and this summer I reported on challenges for Peruvian migrants in Argentina. Can you guys hear me? That's good? Okay. So, the title of my main article is Limited Access, the Challenges and Resilience of Peruvian Migrants in Argentina. And I reported in Buenos Aires, and I actually studied abroad there during my last spring semester, so I reported during that time too, and the dates I did it were March through July 2024. And I want to give some background on my project. So in the Argentine Republic, access to social services and healthcare is universal to everyone, including migrants, but there are still many challenges that they face. And my project specifically focuses on migrants from Peru and traces the challenges and discrimination that they faced in the past, challenges with the new presidential administration of Javier Milei, who came into power last December, and their current resilience in confronting it with their community. So the reason I wanted to do this project was I started studying abroad in around February, and I'm really interested in politics and wanted to study politics in Argentina. And lucky for me, Argentinians love to talk about politics. So it was really cool. Like I would be at like a bus stop and someone would just start like complaining to me about the economy. It was awesome. It was so cool. But I also heard a lot about immigrants and a lot of complaints about immigrants, and it seemed to be tied to the new administration of Javier Milei. And it seemed like kind of similar to me of like the Trump era and how like complaints about immigrants like rose and like it just seemed to be tied with like politics, and I'm interested in immigration. I always have been. So I decided to research it more, and I found a lot of research on challenges for Bolivian migrants in Argentina. But I also saw one article about the death of a Peruvian immigrant, which went uninvestigated, and there were a lot of like statistics and facts in the article about challenges that Peruvians also face in Argentina. But it seemed to be something that wasn't very like researched firsthand. So I wanted to like learn more about this and learn about Peruvian migrants' experience in Argentina. So the reason I was able to write the story was because of the incredible work and dedication of those that I interviewed, people who work for local immigrant resource organizations and Peruvian cultural groups. So these are the different places that the organizations lie and where I interviewed, like different neighborhoods in Buenos Aires. And these are all the interviews I conducted. And on the next slides, I'm going to talk more specifically about most of the interviews and what I learned from them. But I also want to give like a basic overview of my report and what I learned. So in the article, I explored the struggles and determination of Peruvian immigrants, focusing on their difficulties accessing basic services like healthcare and education in Buenos Aires. So Ana, a migrant mother, shared her experience with me when her son fell ill but was neglected at the hospital, which she saw a lot of times and was a common issue due to discrimination against migrants there. And she also spoke to me about how she was denied a lot of jobs when people like saw her ID card and saw that she was from Peru. And despite Argentina's universal healthcare system, a lot of migrants face barriers, which is what I found, such as being asked for the Documento Nacional de Identidad, which is basically the state or federal ID. But it's not required to access services, and it's often hard for immigrants to have it when they need healthcare, like immediately when they get there. It's difficult for them to know where to find it or how. And additionally, Peruvians form a vibrant part of Buenos Aires culture, but they've often been stereotyped as criminals or drug traffickers, according to a lot of the interviews that I did, which compounds their difficulties. And activists like Lourdes have fought for migrant rights, helping thousands obtain legal status through government programs to support immigrants, will make it easier for them to access healthcare and education. But under the new President Milei's government, anti-immigrant policies and rhetoric have worsened conditions. He's had new policies such as charging foreigners for healthcare and increasing immigration fees, which has made life harder for these immigrants. So a lot of his rhetoric revolves around privatizing a lot of things, like from healthcare to education, and increasing immigration fees, which makes it harder for immigrants to migrate and want to migrate. But despite these obstacles, the Peruvian community remains resilient. They continue advocating for their rights, along with a lot of Argentinians in Argentina and Buenos Aires, committed to building a future for themselves and their children and the country they call home. So now I want to talk specifically about the interviews that I did and the work that they're doing in Buenos Aires currently. So first, Lourdes, she's president of the Association of United Peruvian Women Migrants and Refugees in English. So she immigrated in 2006, and she shared with me how at the time it was difficult and not very accessible for her and her friends and family to obtain the state or government ID. So they actually formed this organization to help specifically Peruvian and migrant women. And she told me that there were people at the time who couldn't enroll their children in school because they didn't know how to access the ID or that they had to. And her organization has actually helped settle over 9,000 immigrants in Argentina. And she acknowledged that even though organizations like hers and others exist, there's still a lot of difficulties that exist and that are being compounded right now with the new presidential administration. Next, Roni is an advocate from Peru who works for the Bloc of Migrant Workers. And he discussed with me discrimination and challenges for immigrants in Buenos Aires, whom his organization works to help. And he told me that he thinks that the biggest problem or issue that migrants face is access to housing, but he also discussed with me access to health, education, retirement, work, gender identity, and challenges with Malay. Next, I spoke with Margarita and Pilar, who work for the Centros de Integración para Personas Migrantes y Refugiadas, or Integration Center for Migrants and Refugees. And they're coordinators who assist vulnerable migrants with immigration procedures, documentation, and access to health, education, and social services, while offering workshops and support for integration. And we talked about the healthcare system, and they debunked a lot of prevalent myths about migrants in Argentina, like what I talked about before. A lot of people seem to think that migrants overuse public resources, and that's where a lot of the complaints come from about immigrants. But organizations like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development confirm that that isn't true, and that since the formation of the Argentine state, health and education have been designed as universal services without special treatment for any specific communities. And finally, Anna and Nelly are Peruvian advocates who work for a front of organizations in the struggle. And they coordinate social initiatives like education programs for adults, soup kitchens, gender violence support, community health networks, and vocational training for marginalized, mostly immigrant communities in Argentina. And with me, they discussed firsthand discrimination, like they've seen themselves and with their family, of access to healthcare, school, housing, more, and how they're working with their organization to combat it. So overall, through incredible interviews and the people I met, a lot of these organizations, I went back multiple times. I went to the workshops they did. I got to see what they did specifically and how they helped their community. And I formed a lot of relationships with these people, and they were an incredible part of my abroad experience in Argentina. And I got to learn about and write about how structural barriers and prejudice can coexist with the perseverance of migrant communities. And they've navigated and challenged these with courage and solidarity. Thank you.
Two mics. Wow. Both for me, obviously, Thor. Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Cool.
Cool.
That's good.
Go for it.
Okay. So my name is Gaia. I'm an Italian journalist, and I grew up in Jordan and in Tunisia, and I reported on the Middle East for 3 to 5 years in London prior to coming to the United States. Kira?
My name's Kira. I come from the documentary world. I've worked in documentaries for the last 5 years. And I'm of Jewish Russian heritage. I'm the descendant of Holocaust survivors. We co-directed this short documentary called The Encampment alongside a producer named Jude Taha, who is a Jordanian Palestinian journalist who's not here with us today.
So in October, obviously everyone knows about October 7th, the biggest national and international news story of the academic year that we were in at Columbia. And soon after the Israeli military retaliation against Palestinians in Gaza, we saw really large protests break out on our campus, both on the pro-Israeli side and on the pro-Palestinian side. But as soon as the Palestinian casualties kind of became greater than the Israeli casualties towards maybe mid-October, the pro-Palestinian activist protests really started to grow. And they were demanding that the university divest its financial ties to Israel. And so as soon as we were on the campus, I think we felt the energy shift, and we really started kind of understanding that there was a story here and that this story would not go away. However much I think a lot of people maybe disregarded how important the student protests were at the beginning. So initially, like, I started reporting on it because obviously I grew up in Jordan. This was a very important story to me. And so when I started reporting on it, I realized that obviously there were a lot of barriers because the activists had been doxxed, had been attacked. And for those of you who don't know, doxing is like when someone puts your personal information online and you get a lot of online harassment and trolls, and also like death threats. So obviously it was really difficult to gain the trust of our sources, and that was something that I worked through the whole year. And then April 17th happened.
Yeah, and then we made a little film. So coming out of everything Gaia just said, on April 17th, 2024, a group of pro-Palestine activists, part of a coalition called the Columbia University Apartheid Divest Group, set up tents on our campus. And our short film captures this movement over the 14 days that the tent stood on our campus. And we saw 2 NYPD raids. We also saw an occupation of a building. We saw tense negotiations with Columbia administration and threats of National Guard coming in, politicians from the Speaker of the House, 2 senators and governors on our campus. And we made a character-driven verite film, which means that we tell the story as it happened. We don't cut to standing interviews or anything like that, from the point of view of the activists inside the camp. How do we do the trail? So we wanted to show you guys.
Palestinians have been murdered in Gaza. This is not about repression on this campus alone.
They want to silence us, whatever the cost, and we are not going to be silenced. We knew exactly what we were doing, and we were not planning on leaving until our demand is met or until they drag us out of here. So we'll see what comes first.
There we go.
So one of the most important things about documentary filmmaking is to tell the story through someone's experience, because it's not our story to tell in a way. We focused on Miriam, who was 21 at the time that we made the film. And she had been at the forefront of the protests since October and suffered a myriad of mental health issues because of her work as an activist and being harassed and doxxed and threatened and like losing family on the ground and just all the repercussions that come from it. And because we had been reporting since October, we had kind of worked for her trust in a way. Like, she had seen me at protests under the rain repeatedly, and because of our producer, Jude Taha, who is Palestinian, and she's part of the community, I think it's important also sometimes to admit when you have your own limitations in reporting and to kind of rely on people who come directly from the community. So we could not have done this without Jude, and that's how we got the trust of Miriam. And then Catherine, who's a little bit older, she's 27, she's a postgraduate student. we kind of, once we were in the camp, we kind of understood that she was one of the main organizers. And she was really hesitant to speak with us at first when the encampment first started. But then she saw us every day in the camp, like morning from like 7 a.m. to like night at like 3 a.m. Some nights we didn't sleep at all because we were worried that the NYPD was going to come, and there was no press on campus. So we were going to be one of the only people that were going to be there to see how the NYPD would interact with the students. I'm not American, so I didn't understand kind of like the fact that the National Guard, which is essentially like the military, could like come in. So I think showing face every day and making sure that we were there every step of the way in a way that neither of us had ever done before, because we'd never reported on a conflict situation. I think that's how we won Catherine's trust, and she ended up being one of the main activists that led the occupation of Hamilton Hall. So we were really able to tell like an important side of the story thanks to like the hard work that we put in every day.
Yeah, and we sort of dip in and out of their points of view throughout the film. They serve as narrators in different portions of the story. We're short on time, which is classic us. We could talk about this story for a long time, but I think what our parting wish is to a group of journalists like this is, as Gaia and I have discussed, we come from a specific personal and professional backgrounds, but at face value, we didn't feel like we were the right people to tell this story because neither of us have direct immediate ties to the conflict on the ground in Gaza. And what we ultimately learned is that we were students while this happened. And so this happened on our campus. And, you know, we provided the film of record from the student point of view of what it was like to have over 400 cops over the course of 2 weeks come and raid our campus and turn it into a true conflict zone. And so, you know, we met that moment and I think really rose to the occasion and are excited to share our reporting with you all today.
All right, one more round of applause for all of our panelists. Thank you all. I'll start by asking if any of our panelists want to ask questions of one another.
So obviously for the people who are either reporting on encampments or Palestine, I feel like there's like I really struggle with this, and there's like very specific language that needs to be used or not used. And with this subject in particular, I think in the American context, there's like a very specific narrative around this issue, and I'm just wondering if you guys, I struggled with this so much of understanding what words to use and what words not to use. So I'm just wondering if your reporting also kind of like informed what language you used today also to describe everything that's going on and what you learned from that process.
Yeah, so this was a big challenge for me. That's why I had so many different words to describe similar things on my presentation. And I was quite nervous about the words I should use because those I spoke with, I spoke mostly with them in Arabic, and so obviously there's translation as well. But they use certain terms to refer to things, like I said, the mukawama, or the muqawama dad al-ihtilal, which is the resistance against occupation, is what they use to refer to the groups that are, some are designated terrorist groups. The U.S. designated them, or Israel. So it's important that I listed all of those there because I don't want to I don't want to be biased or to not cover the full story. And I know this is a very sensitive topic, so I also want to make sure that to take into regard many sides. But it's really difficult with this issue, especially when I'm only speaking to one group of people. And so making sure to know other terms people use, even if I didn't use them in my interviewing in Arabic.
I definitely had difficulty with choosing the words not only for today, but for every day since I've started documenting these protests, even back in 2021 when those protests had kicked off. I had asked for advice from people that I really do value the opinions of, and I asked them, am I going to light the room on fire, or are we going to go in peace? And they said somewhere in between. So I think somewhere in between is to just tell the truth and to use the right words. And I think the right word for this situation is, I know we hear it a lot about this conflict or like this difficult situation, but it is a genocide that is taking place right now. And whether we like to admit it or not, America has certain ties that that could end up like blacklisting somebody like me for calling it a genocide. And that's exactly what's happening right now. And it is an apartheid state. And I don't think that that's as radical as people make it out to be, even though it comes with certain consequences. And to answer the question, yeah, I was very afraid of the words that I would use, but as I listen to all of you here today, and especially the panelists today, not to like put value judgments on it, it's just very close to my heart. I know the role of the journalist, and I know how important we are not only to this country, but to the world and to each other. And we have to stand 10 toes on the truth. And the truth of the matter is that this is a genocide, and what is taking place is wrong.
Other panelist questions? Yeah, Luis, go ahead.
So I wanted to ask you guys a little bit about divestment. I know that means something different depending on the university, but of course you guys covered the Columbia encampment, so any of you could answer this. I just want to know what that meant for the Columbia students.
What divestment means?
Yes.
What their demands were?
Yes.
Demands were?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. So, like you said, it's specific to the context, it's specific to the university, specific to the group that is making the demands. Oh, thank you. But at Columbia, they had 3 demands that were central to their argument. The first was divesting from financial ties. First was transparency of funds. We don't even know what our investments are. We don't know how our money is invested. That was the first demand. The second demand was divesting from those financial ties. So understanding what the financial ties are, whether it be in the stock market or in other ways, to the conflict, right? And then divesting from them. So choosing a different way to invest our money, the students' money. And then the third demand was amnesty for students involved in protests on our campus. Columbia, over the course of the year, had multiple instances of bringing in either private investigators to investigate certain groups, certain people in groups, tracking them on campus, blacklisting them in other ways, and they wanted protection from that, from their activism impacting their academic future.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a question to Randi. In my year in Columbia in March of 2023, I was part of a covering religion class with Eric Goldman, and we went to Israel and Palestine. And I have 2 questions because my first question is, how did you experience how did you experience traveling to that place, and more specifically passport control? I'm interested if you have had any sort of interesting experiences in that, because I remember our group, there was one girl who was Muslim, and she underwent like a whole crazy sort of separate interrogation. I'm wondering, I don't know if you did, but I'm just wondering if you had any of that experiences. And the second question I have is, after being there, how are you managing to keep up with the news about the place? Because I remember I went there and then the war sort of erupted a couple months later, and I felt so intimately close to the people there. I was not able to, at first I did watch the news and then it became like emotionally unbearable because of how close I felt. So I wanted to ask you, how do you how you manage with the news and keeping up with what's going on there, and sort of, mentally how you deal with it.
Yeah, those are really interesting questions. So first, about passport control, it was a very long process, but having an American passport really expedites the process, and you have less interrogation. But it's a really long process to get, like I said, from Jordan to Nablus. If I would have just driven there, it would have taken like an hour, maybe an hour and a half, and so it took all day. And so that was a really intense process, and I know for many people it's impossible. For those I worked with in Jordan, the Palestinian refugees and the Palestinians I met in Jordan, they can't travel to Palestine, even if they have family there or they have land there from a long time ago. So it was really a privilege to get to go there. And secondly, with the news, it's really difficult. I mainly just reach out to my friends to make sure they're okay. And when I was there, I met a Palestinian journalist who works for WAFA, or WAFA, which is a Palestinian news organization, and she's amazing. And so I talked to her about it because she's on the ground. Also, some of my friends are EMTs, so they see a lot, and they post some about it, not too much, but they're like on the ground helping people, and they describe a lot of situations where their EMT trucks can't get through, and they try to bring a lot of what they see as EMTs to the world, which I think is really interesting. So I try to connect with my personal connections, but I do follow major news organizations, but I really value my personal connections a little bit more. So yeah, thank you.
Hi, Celeste, UC Berkeley. This is a question about safety, which I think a lot of us in this room have thoughts on. But for the panelists, I'm curious, was there ever a moment in your reporting where you chose your well-being over getting the story, or vice versa, and why?
Okay. So in the first NYPD raid was the second day of the first encampment. So it was in the day, and there were like maybe 200, 300 students witnessing it happen because the campus wasn't locked down. So we were filming, Kira and I were filming in the camp as the NYPD, you can see it in the trailer, as the NYPD comes in, and I think that was our first encounter with the police ever in our careers. And I was so focused that even when they were telling me to get out, I really struggled to get out because I was just like so focused on getting the right shots. And Kira had to be like, Gaia, get out. Like, it's time to go.
Yeah. Wait, sorry. Yeah. Okay, wait, finish your thought. Sorry.
And then in the second NYPD raid, it was late at night. No one was there. The campus was on full lockdown. A lot of outside press wasn't there. There were some members of the press that had snuck in, and we were filming, and the NYPD started kettling us out of our own campus, and also legal advisors and medics were all kicked out. So the NYPD carried the raid completely without outside observation, and I think that felt like the biggest failure on my end. Certainly, I know other journalists who were there felt like that we felt like we failed the story because we weren't there to document it. And I think that, yes, of course, you have to put your safety first and foremost, but also, like, as journalists sometimes, especially if we come from privileged backgrounds, like, I think it was difficult for me, honestly, to, like, excuse myself or, like, go home during those 2 weeks because I was like, this is what journalism is, like, this is what the story is, and if I leave, like, am I doing a disservice to the story? And yes, of course, after the encampment, I saw, like, there were things that were going through my mind that weren't easy, but I'm so glad that I stayed the whole 2 weeks, and I regret not pushing harder to stay when there was the second NYPD threat. That's just my opinion. Like, obviously, I'm not giving advice to anybody else, but that was my experience.
Okay. Different tone. I feel like just from a practical point of view, there was a couple things. First of all, Gaia and I were a team. It's really different than when you're reporting alone. Again, also, I'm American. Gaia's not American. We have completely different understandings of what policing means in this context specifically. Also, when things like the National Guard are thrown around pretty casually, when leaders of groups like the Proud Boys are walking around on your campus, like I had to explain a lot to her in certain settings around that and she was educating me on other parts of the story that I had complete blind spots on. And that's, why working in a pair can be really helpful. We also had cameras. Working with cameras, having camera and not having someone watching your back is actually one of the more dangerous positions you can be in as a journalist. If you have a camera, you're not paying attention to what's going on around you. You're looking at your lens. That's really dangerous. So we had a system of buddying up with other people. In certain circumstances, we would go back to back with our cameras, which is actually not that safe. But we didn't really know what else to do. And in the most extreme of circumstances, when we were worried about arrests, it never really got to that point ultimately, but when we talked about it hypothetically, I always was going to be the one that was going to get arrested. Because like I said, I'm American, I understand this legal system differently, I navigate it differently, I don't have to worry about a student visa, X, Y, and Z reasons. So I think also having safety conversations when you're either with yourself and with people who are, we joke, we had our like law professor's phone number written all over our hands. We were like, sorry, dude, your stuff's gonna be all over the internet. Like, you have to have those systems in place with professors, with your other people you're reporting with or your reporting partner, depending on the story. So I think just from like an advice perspective, that's what I would say to do. And don't go back to back with cameras.
Just a very quick answer to that too. I just, as being a minority in this country and one that looks like what most, right wing or like very extremist people would hate, whether you think I'm Hispanic, whether you think I'm Muslim, whatever you look at me and assume I am to you. And that's all that matters in that moment when you raise your baton towards me or you reach for your gun, whatever the case may be. I've been in situations where I've had flashbang grenades fly on my face. I've been falsely accused of felony crimes that I ended up beating in court, and now I'm in a state and federal level lawsuit against the NYPD for it. And not one moment passed where I was like, I care about my well-being here. Like, I really care about just getting out there, getting the story, and making sure I'm in the front line. So then when a cop does swing his baton in my chest, you could at least know that I did my absolute best to get this truth to you. And no matter what it took from me, mentally or physically, I made sure to do my best to get that picture for you.
I just wanted to say something briefly on this question because my wonderful mom is in the audience, and I think I gave her a little heart attack this summer. And so, yeah, navigating safety in an area like the West Bank was really difficult, and I didn't get to go to any other cities than Nablus because I didn't have the connections to make sure I was safe, and traveling alone was difficult, so it was hard to sacrifice what I was going to do in Ramallah, which is a different Palestinian city, but that trip never happened, so I just wrote about Nablus and just having to accept that. But yeah.
Hello, I'm Emma from UChicago, and thank you all for, all your presentations. They were amazing. I guess one question that I'll open to anyone, but that was brought up for me by Gaia and Kira, your presentation, and I think you all were just touching on it in that last question as well, but the role of identity in your reporting, that was something that both of you talked about a lot from the very first slide, and I think Kira, you said something towards the end of the presentation, like something about, your levels of discomfort telling the story because maybe you're not Palestinian or Palestinian American, things like that. But you did still tell a story. And so I would love to hear you guys expand more on like how you think about that and how you think about kind of the ethics of storytelling, within your identities. But literally that I think that could go for anyone telling this story about whether you're reporting on something that affects, your country, your ethnic group, or not. What does that look like?
Sure. Is that better? Yeah, that's better. I think we all wear like identities as a patchwork, right? And so like for me at face value, like I said, I'm Jewish, I'm Russian. My dad left Russia as a refugee because of Jewish persecution. I'm descended from Holocaust survivors. That is baked into my blood, whether I like it or not. And it informs my opinion of the conflict and what is going on and what is being done in the name of Judaism. But it also means that I was very aware of whether or not this was my story to tell. And Gaia has her own background that informed her, I think, internal conversation on that. But I think ultimately we felt such a part of the story because it was happening on our campus. And because we spent so much time with the student body and we were fellow students, and because we saw how this, I think, discrepancy between what we were experiencing as reporters and what more mainstream media was saying, because they didn't have the access we had because we were students, that ultimately, is where the net landed on why we felt like this was a story that we needed to share and tell it from the point of view of the students. There's a lot of different ways to make a film like this, to tell this kind of a story. There's a lot of different characters you can focus on. There's a lot of different parts of the administration we could have talked to. But ultimately, it's about the students and what they did as the instigators of one of the largest social movements in recent history. They, started a national and international movement. And there was a few encampments before the Colombia one, but the Colombia one really kicked it off in a way around the world. And that's, if we weren't students, maybe we would have told the story differently. But I think that you have to be thinking critically, and if you're asking yourself those questions, that's all that really matters. You shouldn't assume the right to tell any story, but you also shouldn't necessarily, I don't think you should take yourself out of the running at face value. You need to be really critical about how you think about it. No one else?
As far as identity and reporting for me, I'm a very proud son of a Trinidadian woman and a Puerto Rican man, and I believe with that, like the history of colonization that has happened to those two places, it very much informs my opinion and my whole stance and my whole direction. And also knowing that I am a minority in this country and I have faced the teeth of this country, not only in my journalism career, but in my personal life, where stop and frisk was very prevalent during my youth ages, and being thrown against the wall and having people touch all up on me and being embarrassed in the middle of the street. So that those experiences make it to where I know the story I have to tell, and I know my responsibility to tell that story. And while it does affect my objectivity, I believe that being a photographer, which is what I describe myself as, I've never even taken a journalism class, but I love it. I love journalism. To click your shutter is a subjective action. You are picking the moment. You are very aware that this is a moment that you need to document, and you are clicking that button. It is a subjective act. So I just have this internal battle with, do I want to be objective? Even in that poem that I read, you see the battle with objectivity and being silent and even trying to stand in the middle, because being in the middle could be weaponized against people that deserve your strength and I'm very privileged to be in this country, whether I like to admit it or not. Even with all my bad experiences, I still have a privilege and a right to do what I do. So that also comes with the responsibility to do it, and to do it to the best of my ability in a way that will represent my people.
I think that's really interesting what you said about objectivity, and I think that on this subject specifically, it's like a really important thing to talk about. And like when we were in the encampment, like I had like a major broadcaster call me, like an editor that I used to work with, and he said, can you find, like, first thing right off the bat, can you find me someone who's willing to talk about anti-Semitism in the camp? And I said, sure. Are you also going to be interviewing someone who's going to be talking about the genocide? And that editor never got back to me. And I think it's like we learn these rules of journalism in the classrooms, and we learn them in theory, and we can talk about like academic thought, which is what I was at Columbia to do, right? And then when you're actually in the field, these rules do get broken by the most established and the most revered. And I think learning that during the encampment has changed my opinion of journalism a lot, and has shaped me to be who I am. So I really admire the fact that you brought up the fact about objectivity and, the language of genocide. I think that's like really important. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'm Rachel. I'm the Wisconsin fellow. Thank you all so much for your presentations. I wanted to ask specifically about the people who were reporting on encampments. When we were reporting on it at Wisconsin, one of the hardest things that we dealt with that you guys just kind of touched on at the end is having national reporters reach out to us, people we had used to work with or publications we used to work for, saying, oh, could you connect me to sources? Or like, what's your read on this? Like, what do you think? But ultimately, we would see larger publications not cite the student publications that first reported what was happening. And in recent history, like the encampments is for sure the most prominent instance I can think of student journalists being the right people to tell the stories because they had the access like you talked about. For us, it was a very uncomfortable thing to deal with at times. Or I had other people, maybe like, I had times where publications maybe reached out to one of us asking us to be interviewed, and we had to explain that we weren't comfortable giving our opinions as students unless they wanted it purely as a student journalist. So there were a lot of things to navigate that I'm curious how you guys went about doing that on your specific campuses.
Okay, sorry to yap more, but yeah, I think it was really interesting because people, yeah. So a lot of the students a lot of the student journalists started getting a lot of press. I don't know if you guys read any of that, but like the story suddenly became student journalists like at the forefront of reporting at Columbia, and I think that was I think in some way that took away from the original story. But in some way that exemplified the fact that student journalists were kind of like, and I'm not talking about myself, like Kira and I did not do breaking news. No. We none of this footage is out into the world. So it wasn't about us, it was about our classmates and the amazing students at WKCR, the undergraduate student radio, and the amazing students at the Spectator. Yes, and the Barnard Bulletin. Shout out. And but they became famous because they were reporting from a community journalism point of view. Like they were part of the community. They had been part of the community since the start of the year. They had been reporting on the story since the start of the year. And so I think everyone trusted them more than the national media, who couldn't even have access to campus. Like we had NBC journalists, like. Actually, it wasn't just NBC. It was a lot of journalists. Let me not single them out because that's not fair. But there were a lot of mainstream journalists that were like angry that we got access and they didn't, right? So like, I think that's why they were really. It was like we kind of changed the rules of journalism on itself, and that was like really, really powerful. And then I think to your point, like. The idea that you can't be objective if you're reporting on your own community and you have to give an opinion, I think is problematic in itself, because if you come from that community, just like when Black Lives Matter, the protests broke out and we were all like, it's great to see Black journalists at the forefront of this story. Like, it's great to see students at the forefront of this story. It's great to see Palestinian journalists on the ground sacrificing themselves to tell this story. So I think that also goes back to the objectivity conversation that I could yap about for hours. So let me stop there. But yeah, I think that's important.
Sorry. Okay, the other thing is like we had I think every campus was different. And how you were reporting on it was really different, but at least in our experience at Columbia, we had sort of formed an ad hoc little newsroom that ultimately the number of students grew quite a bit, but at its core, I would say it was between 7 and 11 students, led by 1 or 2 professors whose expertise were in visual journalism or conflict reporting, and they were like functionally our editors in that setting, and we sort of all would do what you would do in a newsroom, where you talk about this editor is reaching out to me, this is the rate that they're offering me, this person is being really disrespectful to me, how do I handle it? And you just talk through it, and that's also a big part of learning how to do journalism, not just like in theory, but in practice, like Gaia was saying. And we collectively decided, again, like Gaia said, we weren't really a part of these conversations from a impact point of view because we weren't selling our footage or doing breaking news, but like, we have 2 colleagues who are Palestinian journalists, and they were student journalists at Columbia at the time in the graduate school with us, and they were like, I'm not your fixer. Like, I'm not here to give you, I'm a reporter, and if you want to hire me as a reporter, I will gladly do work for you as a reporter if you credit me. But just because I'm a student and just because I'm wear the part of an identity that you think I have an in with the community doesn't mean that I'm going to hook you up with the activists that I've built trust with over the last 6 months or even longer. So I think it's also about discussing these problems as they come up so that you can all feel empowered to make decisions that feel editorially aligned with your values and the truth, but also, you know, honor the tradition of journalism itself and what you're meant to do as a journalist in these situations.
Yeah, and I've definitely been approached by like different platforms or people or influences, organizations, but I've never sold a single picture of mine. I've never sold the rights to anything that I've done. I'm very, I take it very seriously where my stuff is being platformed, published. It needs to be accessible. I don't want any paywall standing between a kid on their phone or a scholar writing their thesis and my work. I want it to be accessible, and I want it to reach the people, and I want it to reach the people in a way that is actually productive and tells the truth. As far as navigating the campuses, I come from a very small school that is pretty much like a nobody school in New York City. Like, not to say nobody, but like, you could ask somebody that lives down the block what the name of my school is, and 9 times out of 10, they probably won't know. But, so I'm not coming from even a student journalist place. I'm not a part of any orgs or any student orgs or anything like that. So I really had to get into these encampments and show people my resume from 2020 and show them my Instagram page. I had to put the lens cap on my camera and just speak to people, sometimes even showing up to spaces without a camera at all and without my press badge at all, to let them know even if I wasn't doing this work, I would still be in this environment doing another role of this. And I loved that experience. I loved being able to work on the ground and navigate those things. What I didn't love so much was, you know, I love my school to death, but as a journalist and just as a person with integrity, you have to call things out when you see them. And my school is very, very silent in regards to what's happening right now. And it's not even like they're calling it a conflict or they aren't calling it a genocide. No, they're just very one-sided, and they have chosen their side. And they have even posted flags and posts that are very one-sided, and now building programs with Israel for students to go over there and study and whatnot, whatever the case may be, which has made me consider stepping down from my presidential position within an honor society in the school. And as much as I do love the professors and some of the faculty of my school, it made it very hard for me to even do this right now, because I know when the president sees it or finds out, oh, he's the one that won, and he clicks that story, he's probably going to be livid, or somebody in that administration is going to be livid, or some person who donates to the school is going to be livid at the fact that I was platformed like this. But it didn't stop anything, and I think it's so important to just keep going. And even if you're not platformed, platform yourself, post things yourself, and the connections will come.
Yeah, I think also like some of the students that were reporting with us turned down opportunities to publish with major news outlets that they felt had a specific narrative in their reporting. And I think it's like, as you said, it's like sometimes about not having those opportunities because it's like morally corrupt. Yeah, exactly. So I think a lot of students had like that moral dilemma, and like sometimes it's not about advancing your career. It's maybe about standing up for journalism, because journalism is about telling the story, and it's about telling both sides of the story equally.
And the money doesn't always matter. I mean, I'm coming from a single-parent household. My father passed away when I was young due to 9/11 related cancer. He was a first responder, and trust me, I could use the money when it's thrown at me. And it's not about that. You can't sell your integrity out here, and you have to make sure that when you tell a story that you stand on that story and you stand behind it, even if you're the only person who reads it. And that's what I'm really proud of, the fact that I did, and I can not only assume, I could damn near tell you for sure that the people on this panel also did that.
One more round of applause for our panelists.